Today, we are speaking with Mishal Thadani about what they are building at Rhizome.
What Rhizome is a climate resilience software planning tool for utilities. We work with grid planners and grid operators, and who are also figuring out how to invest in the system to harden it and improve the reliability and resilience of the system.
What they do is they identify the highest areas of impact as well as provide granular data suggestions on which specifically to invest in.
Tree trimming has become a giant budget line item for utilities, spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year. When you look at the restoration costs, 75 to 80% is labor. And then the remainder, 20-25%, is actual rebuild of infrastructure. When you're building a company in a very deep domain, is that if you're selling to engineers, you have to think like an engineer and you have to talk like an engineer.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the CleanTechies podcast. I'm Silas Maynor, your favorite clean tech headhunter, and today we are speaking with Mishal Thadani about what they are building at Rhizome. To set the stage, extreme weather conditions and events are costing utilities a lot of money. They have very limited budgets to prepare for these events, so it's actually very necessary to be really particular and specific about where that money is being invested. And Rhizome helps utilities do that. What they do is they identify the highest areas of impact as well as provide granular data suggestions on which specifically to invest in. So for example, instead of upgrading an entire line of poles, you can actually just upgrade the 15 that are at high risk. So on top of their technology, he actually does a breakdown of how exactly they grew the team and are growing the team, how they are going to market, selling to one of the most difficult customer types out there, utilities. And there's just, generally speaking, a lot of juice to squeeze out of this episode. So I would recommend getting out a notepad to take some notes and see what comes to mind and sticks out at you as you go through the episode. Before we start, don't forget to sign up for the upcoming Hack Summit in New York City at New Lab, happening December 10th and 11th. You can sign up today using the link in the show notes. And shout out to our sponsors, Earth Tech Talent, the search firm that I run, helping clean tech startups hire top talent, but without it costing a fortune. All right, enjoy the episode. All right, welcome to the podcast, Mish. How you doing?
Doing great today, coming to you live from Menlo Park, California.
Absolutely, man. We were just talking about this beforehand, but I definitely I'm a fan of the different areas of the Bay, but we'll have to save the weather and all the history there for another day. But really excited to have you on. Obviously, I've known about what you guys are doing with Rhizome for a while. I don't know if do you pronounce it Rhizome or Rhizome?
Rhizome, yeah.
Rhizome, that's what I figured. But I know about what you guys are doing for a little bit, and I'm super excited to finally get you on. But before we get into it, I do want to have you start off by just looking back at your story. Do you feel like there was a certain kind of clear point where you decided that you were going to build a company and become an entrepreneur?
Yeah, and I appreciate the question. Is oftentimes the background is what leads to the entrepreneurial journey. And I'd say for me, moving from Texas to DC about 10 years ago opened up a lot of opportunities. I thought I saw a bunch of different folks in the energy space doing a lot of interesting things, both on the technology side, on the development side, where at the time I was at a residential and commercial solar development shop, but then also on the policy side. So I definitely got very interested in the policy side of things. And the more that I got involved in local DC policy activities when I was there, the more that I realized that policy can actually lead to new businesses that help then subsequently achieve those policy goals, right? I think if you're looking at the space from afar, it can be hard to draw those connections, or if you're removed from the folks who are actually doing that type of work. But I thought moving to DC was really pivotal for me. And I was at a solar startup. And so going from previously where I was in the wind industry, utility scale, at that time was a very cookie cutter approach to developing a wind farm, aside from all the permitting issues, which I had to deal with on a day-to-day basis. But going into a solar startup that in a booming residential solar market at the time, again, about 10 years ago, is where I realized that good ideas can actually flourish. And so it could be good ideas within the business to help the business grow, but it could also be good ideas more broadly, right? When you're at a startup, folks talk about what's the next big thing, or what's the thing that can be a change maker in the future as technology develops. And so getting that shift in mindset, I think was critical, both being in DC as well as at a solar startup where you're just in the realm of a more entrepreneurial mindset in general.
So you didn't necessarily have the plan to launch a company, but until you started to see hey, this consequence, there's this opportunity here, plus maybe the influences of being in a startup at the time.
Yeah, and I was always more policy driven doing market development work.
Mm,
So effectively evaluating state policies and where are the best opportunities for residential, commercial, and then later on when states would pass community solar rules, then community solar, right? And so I've always had that entrepreneurial mindset of where do we expand the business based off of policy, right? Now I'll fast forward to why I actually launched Rhizome. I started leading regulatory and strategy for a company called Urbint, and we were applying AI and machine learning based tools for a variety of operational risk use cases in the utility sector. Think being able to leverage machine learning on infrastructure, gas pipeline data, historical data, and then leak data that from inspections, and training machine learning models to be able to predict gas leaks on the distribution system more proactively. And that was one example of the machine learning models that we were building. And what was my job is how do you actually create the incentive structure for utility to adopt these technologies and actually expand them. So I was spending a lot of time with regulators, a lot of time with utilities, and developing the business value and the value proposition for ratepayers at the end of the day. And the thing that I started paying attention to quite a bit in terms of a trend was, of course, the rise in the extreme weather impacts in terms of their frequency and intensity of those extreme weather events, and impacts to communities and utility systems that can cause devastating consequences. And in the case of wildfires, bankruptcy. PREPA also went into bankruptcy after Hurricane Maria. So it's not just a
mm,
wildfire hazard that is critical to utilities. But the point is that the frequency and intensity of these events have been rising. I think 2021, when Winter Storm Uri hit Texas, was a pivotal moment for me to want to kind of focus in on this resilience issue and what can we actually do to better build a more resilient system, and what would be the most consequential practices in building that resilient system. So here were my observations. First, utilities are getting affected by events, PG&E, the utilities in Texas, Hurricane Maria, and then of course Hurricane Sandy in the Northeast, as well as a few other events. That led to utilities putting together, in addition to responding to those events and those events being expensive, but also putting together multi-$100 million, if not multi-billion-dollar investment plans to improve the resilience of their grid. When regulators see these investments, they have no way to evaluate what is the resilience value and is it going to be worth the ratepayer dollars going in. So this is the real, I would call it like nexus or issue, that bridges the gap between utilities and the regulators that I effectively wanted to solve for, because I knew how important it is. If we can get on the same page in terms of what the risks are and how do you mitigate them, then society itself is in a much better place. So this is what led to launching Rhizome, right? I really found on further investigation a lack of tools and models, really in effect a system resiliency model that could help a utility understand comprehensively on individual assets and parts of the system what are the risks and what are the best tools that we have in our toolbox at each location to mitigate those risks based off of the characteristics of the system and the hazards that those assets are exposed to.
So I've got a number of things that I might want to circle back to, but I think we should back up just a tad. And can you just explain in a very succinct manner for non-technical people,
Yeah.
what is Rhizome doing and how does it work?
Yeah, absolutely. I may have jumped the gun there a little bit. So, what Rhizome is a climate resilience software planning tool for utilities. We work with grid planners and grid operators, and these are the folks who operate the transmission and distribution lines, and who are also figuring out how to expand the system to connect new loads, but also how to invest in the system to harden it and improve the reliability and resilience of the system. And there's a clear distinction between reliability and resilience in that reliability is typically referred to as, hey, how do we deliver power under normal operating conditions, right? Make sure that, for 99% of the year, 99.9% of the year, we can safely and efficiently do that with very minimal interruption. But then also, how do we withstand the impact of any external factors, right? And that's what we refer to as resilience. So we build software tools for engineers and planners at utilities to be able to help them assess the vulnerabilities on their system, again, at high degrees of resolution, so they can get much more precise about which investments to make where. We can then design different scenarios and simulations of investments that they could make. And what are the anticipated outcomes? Say if they were to experience an extreme weather event, a category 1 hurricane, what would be the number of outages that they get post-investment versus pre-investment, right? That's the type of simulation that we do within our modeling tool. And then what's the set of investments that best helps mitigate those types of events? And then lastly, we should bring climate change into the picture, because this is the whole reason why we're experiencing this challenge in the first place. It's not a status quo of extreme weather events. These things are changing. And so the last thing that we do is we bring in climate models. And so these are data sets that are a representation of physical climate models looking out decades into the future based off of different emission scenarios. And in a given geographic area, can we understand over the landscape how the extreme weather events are anticipated to change? So how are the precipitation, wind, extreme temperature, humidity anticipated to change over time, given what we've seen in history and given what's projected from a climate perspective? And usually that starts at a 50-kilometer resolution from the publicly available data sets, but then you can downscale that to finer resolutions using machine learning and physical approaches down to, say, the 1-kilometer level. So you can get a 1-kilometer geospatial sense of what's going to be the impact of climate change in an area. And that's what we use to couple with our system modeling of the assets and the response to extreme weather.
Got it. So I'm going to try to make sure I got this right. So just to maybe say in very simple terms, if I'm running a utility, right, I've got different people who are trying to make sure that the lights stay on. And if we have limited budget to invest in upgrades or prevention or replacing old stuff, we need to figure out where should we focus those dollars. And this allows this software to allow me to make more informed decisions rather than just kind of taking a guess.
That's exactly right. Right. It really an optimization. How do we get the most resilience value, or the reduction of risk is another way to put it, for all of the dollars going in? And let me just give you a couple of examples of some of the activities that utilities are doing kind of on a day-to-day basis, right? They're doing a lot of tree trimming, right? The cause of many wildfires out west is the intersection of vegetation with power lines. And so tree trimming has become a giant budget line item for utilities. They do this at scale, right? Spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year, per large utility. They're hardening the system. So this is things like replacing aging assets with new and better standards equipment. A good example there is if you could be replacing an old Eastern cedar wooden pole with a new composite pole to withstand higher wind speeds, right? They're doing other types of overhead system hardening as well. They're putting overhead assets underground, which is an extremely important activity to reduce wildfire risk, especially, as well as other overhead risks, especially in high consequence areas. And then one more that I'll mention is they are continuing to sectionalize the system to make it more resilient, where if there is a failure, fewer customers lose power, or there's an automatic self-healing of the grid where you can automatically switch. If there's a failure in one place, you have 100,000 customers lose out, you switch, you reroute power, and you can bring 50,000 customers back online automatically, right? So the increase in complexity of network topology, as we would call it, is one of the major activities that utilities are engaging in a really positive basis.
Yeah. And then I guess just for my understanding, this doesn't seem like it's something that there's been various forms of planning for probably, many, many decades in the utilities, but why is this specific technology important now? Is it just due to the climate change issues? Is it just broadly energy demand rising? Like, why is this so much more important now? Clean tech startups need to hire the right talent to hit their milestones, especially in the early days. Without the right team, you'll never make it to your Series A round. And after years of observing this struggle that pre-seed and seed stage clean tech startups have to get the right talent, I decided to create Earth Tech Talent. Our mission is to help clean tech companies hire the best talent so they can succeed and make the world greener. So whether you need some advice on how to craft your talent acquisition strategy, you need to increase your number or quality of applicants, or you need help screening the candidates to save you some time, or you just need traditional headhunting services, reach out today. We have priced everything so that even a pre-seed startup can afford it. Fundamentally, you're only building in clean tech startups because you care about humans. Your hiring process should reflect that. Work with us to craft a hiring process that is human-centered. Doing this will lead to all those job applicants becoming your biggest champions in the public. And even if they get rejected, we make it so that they will still have a positive experience and they'll want to apply again in the future, and they'll be your biggest advocates. To get in touch, reach out to me on LinkedIn or go to earthtechtalent.com/contact. That's Earth, ERTH, techtalent.com/contact. All right, back to the show.
Yeah, I think it's a confluence of factors, right? But maybe I would go into the most like macro of senses and say that these are businesses and organizations. They face risk. They have insurers. There are credit rating agencies where they can't get capital if their credit rating agencies dips or their cost of capital rises significantly, right? And so what you see at the most macro of levels is that the investors and insurers for utilities are seeing, challenges related to electrification and the need to build out a lot more infrastructure. They're seeing challenges related to extreme weather events, and they're seeing challenges on the regulatory front. So the utilities being able to actually go recover costs and rate-based things as they once were when affordability becomes more of a crisis, right? So that confluence of factors is leading utilities to become much more precise about how they're spending their dollars. And so we obviously only represent one area of capital expenditure for utilities, and that is like, the reliability and resilience investments that they're making. But then, so that's kind of what's happening in the macro level utility landscape. On the technology side of things, we've always had extreme weather events, but there haven't always been the tools available to actually understand the effect of those extreme weather events. So we're in a really interesting point where we have a lot now of available weather data, as well as physical models related to how weather, even if you're not picking up weather between two observation towers, you have reanalysis products that is able to estimate weather conditions between observation towers. You have climate projection models that are becoming more and more refined over time. And then the last thing that I'll say is that utilities actually have now a lot more data over the last 10 years, right? Mm-hmm. Usually when we implement a model with a utility, we look at the last 8 to 10 years of their historic failures on their system, right? If you were to rewind 10 years ago, would you then have a 10 years of outages that you could build a model off of? Probably not, right? Because typically when we look at utilities, they don't have a robust set of 20-year failure and outage history. So utilities have been getting a lot better over time with their data management practices and collection and management practices. There's more availability and data on weather and climate. And then the last thing to finally mention on the technology side is the modeling technologies, right? The ability to very quickly ingest and process data. And then, of course, machine learning models that can be trained at very low cost to be done to do rapid iteration, rapid simulation, so on and so forth. So all of those things are reasons why this is now an affordable product that utilities can leverage on demand and be able to run all sorts of models and analyses on a dynamic basis, as opposed to, say, hiring a consultant on a one-time basis.
So on this idea of affordability, I guess I've always been curious to understand a little bit more. What do the costs of these events, outages or causing a wildfire, do you have any examples of what the typical costs are to the utilities if they do not prevent these from happening? Mainly ask this because, depending on that price tag, they should be willing to spend hypothetically a very large amount of money to prevent that. So can you just give some people an idea of the kind of the how big of a number we're talking about here?
Yeah, absolutely. So 2024, just for like non-utility numbers, was the worst year in terms of billion-dollar disasters. So we had $27 billion disasters in 2024, and that's the most we've ever had. Now that's of course two major trends, right? Like we are having more extreme events, but also we are putting more equity into the ground, right? There's more capital at stake whenever there is an extreme weather event that happens. More buildings, more critical infrastructure, more economics involved, right? So those are the trends, right? So the costs are rising quite dramatically for individual utilities. And when you report utility losses, a few years ago there's a Hurricane Ian in Florida that cost about 1.2 to 1.4 billion dollars to restore. And if I could just focus in on that, like what goes into those costs, right? When a hurricane hits for a utility is obviously preemptively, they know the hurricane's coming. They have to go and stage crews, right? For a Category 4 hurricane, for instance, they're anticipated to have a ton of failures and a ton of work on their plate to restore the system. So it's not just the utilities crews, but then they have to call crews from neighboring states. You'll even get, crews from your home state in Wisconsin going to help out the folks in Florida. So that's actually where the costs start to rack up quite a bit, is what we refer to as mutual aid. So it's really expensive to bring those folks in. They get paid, more than what they would get paid on a normal basis. You have to host them in hotels. You have to bring in a ton of equipment. That adds up for a major, major event. And so when you look at the restoration costs, 75 to 80% is labor. And then the remainder, 20, 25% is actual like rebuild of infrastructure, right? And again, that's a general figure for events broadly, but that's typically what you'll see is much more on the labor side of things. So those are the things where if you are able to reduce the impact of events, you'll start to see a dramatic decrease in those costs, right?
Mainly because you're saying if they can preemptively make sure the grid is more prepared for it, they won't have as many things break, which means
Yeah,
less people to come in and fix this.
that's exactly right. So for
Okay.
subsequent years after that hurricane, I believe there Hurricane Helene as well as one or two other hurricanes since Ian, FPL has invested in their transmission system to harden it to 150-mile-an-hour winds. They have
Mm-hmm.
not had a failure on their transmission system since, right? If you have a
Oh
failure on the
wow.
transmission system, that's major dollars going to, obviously a ton of people lose power with the transmission system, but it takes a huge effort to kind of rebuild the transmission system. It takes a longer amount of time, more folks to do it. But yeah, that's exactly right.
So I mean, in that case, like if the power lines are getting knocked over all the time, if they can just again spend, it's obviously expensive to replace these all, but if you can replace them in the first place, you're going to avoid the long term costs. And this is a great example of proof that things have not fallen over because they've basically hurricane proof these to an extent. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then if you maybe move to the other coast where you have PG&E making a bunch of wildfire investments, especially after the Camp wildfire that ended up causing their bankruptcy in 2019, they've spent a ton on wildfire mitigation, right? They have shown a reduction in wildfire ignitions in their service area since they've been making those investments. And so you can, even on a year by year basis, demonstrate how you are reducing risk, right? By making those
Mm.
proactive investments. So, but at the end of the day, right? Like these things need to be more informed. There needs to be an equation where we can with some level of confidence say these are the dollars at risk in the next year, in the next 10 years, in the next 50 years. And if you spend varying amounts of dollars today, in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, under different types of scenarios, this is going to be the anticipated risk reduction at the other end of the spectrum. So right now, there's no one that can deliver this at scale, which is why we launched Rhizome, is to make those important high-level decisions in terms of how much do we actually spend today in what categories and programs to effectively manage and reduce that risk, but then getting much more precise even within the program level. For instance, if a utility has a pole replacement program, which poles need to be replaced. If you what we've seen is like top 1% of poles are the cause of about 30 to 40% of the risk, right? So if you just targeted investment on 1% of the poles, you can manage that risk much more effectively.
I see. So it's not even just like wholesale programs. It's like we have data on individual items that we can go out and instead of replacing an entire 6 miles of poles, we can replace just maybe a handful.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I want to. So I don't know exactly how to ask this question, but I do want to back up on the incentive structure a bit. So could you help us understand the incentive structure for utilities? A typical business is like, what do my customers want, right? And in the case of a utility, it's a little bit of a different setup because they're regulated. So are they primarily, is their main incentive just, hey, we got to keep the lights on and reduce the cost for our customers, or is there another incentive structure that's kind of pulling and having attention against servicing and providing electricity for as cheap as possible?
Yeah, I would say that the extreme weather events are causing the incentive structure to shift a little bit, right? Traditionally, utilities have expanded the grid. When they expand the grid, they're able to make 10% of all the capital investment they make, give or take a couple of percentage points, right? And that's their profit model. And their incentive is around reliability, of course, right? Like they're regulated to make sure that uptime exists for as many customers as possible.
I am super excited to share that we at CleanTechies are going to be making content at the upcoming Hack Summit in New York City. This is returning to New Lab December 10th and 11th. And here with me to tell us more about Hack Summit is Laura Hodgkiss. from Climate Hack.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to just break down a little bit more about this summit. A lot of people are not familiar. So, in brief, can you just tell us what is Hack Summit?
Yes, absolutely. So we're really excited. Last year we came to New York for the first time, having hosted 5 events in Switzerland. We had a fantastic success, amazing people that were joining. It was investors, founders, corporates, CVCs and operators, all within the climate deep tech space with a real enthusiasm and commitment to collaborate. And
Mhm.
it's really a chance for everyone to come together. We want to accelerate more investment into climate deep tech, unlock those opportunities. We want more startups to be seen by investors and investors and operators to find their next scale up partner, find new partnerships to grow, collaborations that spark at the Hack Summit, then go on to create great success.
Especially the focus on the deep tech side of things is really important because it's very difficult to move these things forward. So Climate Hack is the organization that's putting this on. Could you tell us a little bit more about Climate Hack specifically?
Yeah, definitely. So, Climate Hack is a global community. The team is based in Switzerland, but we have ambassadors who work all around the world with us, and they're putting on local free events in their communities. The aim is really to bring together people that could be students, it can be investors, startups, and founders coming together. And then throughout the year, we're writing different editorial content to connect the dots between investors and startups so that more people can understand what's going on, what are these technologies, and how can they get involved in the climate tech space. And the Hack Summit is really the occasion where everyone can come together twice a year now for the Hack Summit to be able to have those exchanges and get together.
Can you tell us a little bit more about who is going to be there? Any particular names you want to mention, or generally the type of people who will show up?
Yeah, definitely. So we have a wide range of founders working across the climate deep tech space, and they're going to be joining us for fireside chats with partners from the VCs that are backing them as well to uncover their journey. So, for example, we have Cody Fink, who is the co-founder and CEO of Brimstone. He's going to be joining Rachel Slaybell, who's a partner at DCVC. And then we have, for example, Liz Dennett from Enderlith, and she's going to be speaking to Deborah Zajak of SOSV to talk about her scale up and growth. And then also we can learn about what's happening at SOSV. We have Sampriti Bhattacharya, who is building America's first all-electric hydrofoiling vessel. And then I'm also personally excited about Laureen Meru, who's the founder and CEO of Hertha Metals. I'm sure you probably saw as well, she recently came out of stealth with 17 million. And now she's forging the future of steel.
Yeah, there's so many really fascinating companies. What are you most excited for about Hack Summit this year, particularly?
It's a really exciting moment when you enter and all of these incredible founders and these investors and these operators. It's that it's that real energy in the room, I think, that sets it apart from other conferences. You know, the most senior partners from the VC funds or the Series B, Series C founders are really willing to talk to the earlier stage founders or make time for everyone. And I think that's really what the climate deep tech community is. It's really, really powerful.
Who should apply to come to the Hack Summit?
So the Hack Summit is the perfect event for founders that are fundraising. It's for investors that are looking to find what's new and next that's happening in the climate deep tech space. And it's also open for CVCs that are looking to partner with startups and operators that are working in the space. If they share our passion and excitement for scaling deep tech solutions, then they should be in the room.
And where can people apply to come to the Hack Summit?
So hacksummitny.com is the website to go. We've got the sign up there.
Yeah, it was as soon as I saw that this was happening, I was like, man, I have to go because half of your main speakers have been on the podcast already. So
I saw,
it's a
yes, yeah.
perfect fit for us. But no, I'm really excited for this, and I hope just encourage everybody, if you have the opportunity, come to this summit to learn from founders who have already scaled to a very large extent. Maybe you need to learn from somebody who's further along, or you've got some lessons to share with other founders earlier in their journey. So apply to come today. You heard it. The link will be in the description, and we hope to see you there. So that you're saying that when they invest with new capital expenditures, they make 10% of the new capex as their profit, basically, that goes to their bottom line.
Yeah.
And then there's not incentive on the OpEx side other than regulatory, like, hey, you got to keep people's lights on.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So on the OpEx side, they have a set budget that's agreed between the utility and the regulator on an annual basis. Mm-hmm. They run those programs. If they're able to meet the objectives of reliability, but with lower OpEx, then they get to pocket that OpEx, right? So there's an incentive to reduce OpEx so that they can increase their profits or increase their CapEx to increase their profits. So those are that's the dual nature of the CapEx versus OpEx incentives.
Got it. Okay. And then you continue. You were saying that the extreme weather events are kind of shifting this?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So with extreme weather events shifting, you now have insurers raising their premiums. You have credit ratings agencies that are potentially affecting the cost of capital structure for a utility. And so if they're not adequately managing their risks, their operating costs are going to rise, right? So these are new incentives that are causing utilities, especially with relation to wildfires today, to manage their risks much more carefully through more proactive investment. So those are some of the incentives that are at play here. And then obviously we can talk about performance-based rate making, which gets much more into like, okay, how does the return on equity for utility change if they hit certain metrics like reliability metrics? But broadly speaking, what we're aiming to position ourselves to utility as is, hey, let's help you assure that you can maintain your CapEx spend on hardening investments that are actually going to make a difference. Let's help you measure how you're going to achieve an improvement in reliability and a reduction of OpEx during the extreme weather events, because those are operating expenses at the end of the day. And then lastly is let's show insurers and credit ratings agencies that you're doing the right thing in mitigating your risks so that your organizational operating costs don't rise from an insurance premium perspective. Yeah. Or that at least they're more managed, because they've all been rising, and there's it's commensurate with the amount of risk that utilities are exposed to, especially in the case of wildfires. But again, show that the proactive investments will lead to actually a mitigation of insurance premiums, which is a real focus for our team right now.
Yeah, because I can imagine those continue to rise pretty drastically. So that's very, I think that's a really succinct summary of what it makes really sense, because I'm just visualizing, being the utility kind of in the middle, and they have this regulatory body, they have obviously needs, but if you can on multiple fronts help them get their costs down, they can have more profit to the bottom line while still, keeping the people's lights on and people a little bit more happy, right? So it's very fascinating. I guess it is fascinating to me, first of all, just how did you understand exactly how to build this product, particularly like with all of those core things in mind? I do want to understand, like, was that something you got right away because of your past experience, or was it after some time in the market that you finally realized, okay, here's the core things that we got to be able to reduce costs on all fronts?
I think that maybe two basic ways, and many people will probably argue about this, on how to launch a new startup. It's actually a technology startup, is to either start with a cutting edge technology that it has an application somewhere, right? You built something really cool, and you want to take it to market and provide value to people, right? So that's one way that people start companies. The other way that people can start companies is that they have deep expertise in a market, and they have certain insight that other folks or rather a limited number, a set of people have those same insights. And therefore there is maybe a little window of opportunity that you have to target that, a product to satisfy that insight, to satisfy some sort of need, and then be able to capitalize on it by bringing technology to the table that exists, right? So I'm less of a technology expert, even though I worked previously at an AI company, but I definitely had a lot of exposure to the utility market, and primarily it was understanding the regulatory dynamics that were at play. So again, following the thread here, with the trend of extreme weather getting worse, with the impact to customers getting worse, and the cost rising, regulators have been building these resilience frameworks that they want utilities to follow, right? So if utilities are now having to implement, wildfire mitigation plans that they've never had to do before, or a resilience plan that they've never had to do before, there's a lot of information that needs to go into those plans. So where I work backward from is, what is the best information to include in those plans that's going to make a regulator happy, right? And that's literally backed into a software product to satisfy that core need. Now, in the process, there's a bunch of additional value propositions that we provide, because at the end of the day, we found that a planning tool is really what's required to ensure that any investments that the utilities are making are meeting the policy objectives of the state, right? And
so do you link those two things together so they can see kind of the connection?
Absolutely. So we directly derive cost benefit metrics for investments within our tool. We can show the trends within dashboards of extreme weather events, of how certain investments are going to have certain impacts in certain areas, and help the utility generate this narrative. Now, I use the word generate very intentionally, because over time, we may help a utility use generative AI to actually produce a narrative and that they can then refine and then send to the policymakers, right? As one add-on feature. But absolutely, that's a core value proposition for the product. But it all started because I myself was very interested in the policy outcomes, right? How do we build a more resilient system? And then, knowing that machine learning and climate risk tools exist, putting those pieces together to actually generate the product that engineers, again, would make everyday decisions on that would lead to those policy outcomes. But again, it wouldn't have happened without the exposure to the utility in the regulatory market or the exposure to the machine learning, and the geospatial analytics market, which is so important too.
How important is it that you have understood these different incentives and dynamics for the selling to the utility process? Because I am curious if you want to maybe brag about what kind of scale you guys have reached so far, any of the key wins. But selling to utilities is notoriously difficult. But how have you figured out, like maybe because of how you built the product, that even the engineers, like they understand the incentives from the policy perspective, you bring this all together so that it makes sense and they're willing to buy right away?
Yeah, I think, and this is one core piece of my background that I haven't mentioned yet, is that I studied engineering in college. And so I've always had kind of a civil engineering mindset when I've been trying to solve problems, right? And so what's, I think, critical, especially when you're building a company in a very deep domain, is that if you're selling to engineers, you have to think like an engineer and you have to talk like an engineer, right? And so it's not just about the value proposition of the product or, the core technology at the root of it, right? It really has to resonate with the buyers who get flooded, especially utility planners and engineers get flooded with new technologies that they could be using, hundreds, if not thousands over the course of years, right? And so really being able to stand out by speaking the language and taking a really nuanced approach to how you're going to solve their problems is critical to scaling a company here. And that's why we've had some early success, is we've really been able to figure out the product marketing piece very quickly. And so we're now working with utilities in 3 different countries, in the US, Canada, and the UK. Geographic diversity. So in the US, we have the Pacific Northwest utility in Texas and a few in the Northeast. And so we've been doing a mixture of kind of pilot types of engagements, but as well as bringing people on enterprise-wide onto our software application. And then we're about to make an announcement, not to be a tease over here, but we're about to make an announcement very soon next month with a major utility in the Northeast that's using our Wildfire product called GridFirm. And yes, I did say that utility in the Northeast who's using our Wildfire product because
I was going to say that doesn't sound like the obvious assumption there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So we again, being able to resonate with these folks and send them, the right messaging to really refine the needs. And I will say every time we go into a utility conversation, a new introduction with a potential customer, we do a ton of research within their regulatory filings, right? And so there is specifically a slide that says, hey, this is what we know about you related to what we do. And therefore we can jump ahead in the conversation to here's the value prop that we think will help based off of these characteristics of what you've been going through in front of your regulator and how you've already kind of defined your planning challenges, as they oftentimes do in their regulatory filings.
I mean, so that's very fascinating. This idea of scaling the unscalable, right? Like doing the upfront research, because I think a lot of people nowadays with AI tend to just want to spray and pray as they do sales. And it's like, maybe you're going to get some conversions, but at the end of the day, like you could also spend that same amount of effort into a handful of conversations or outreach compared to, thousands of it. So I am curious, when you go first of all, what does your typical sales cycle look like to land that initial sale, even if it's just a pilot?
Typical sales cycle, it'll typically take us, if we do have an interested party, anywhere from 6 to 12 months. So we've gotten deals closed in as soon as 3 months. We had a major multi-year, deal close with a Fortune 500 customer in 5 months. But really has to start with a point of interest, right? Because just because you have an introduction call with someone, it doesn't mean that you're having the introduction call with the right person. It has to be with, of course, the buyer, someone who has the budget, and they have to actually, be in a position of need, right? And actually looking for a solution. So if you have qualified those things in your lead, then the sales cycle is actually fairly manageable. I would say estimate anywhere from 4 to 5 to 12 month sales cycle should be average, right? If
And
you
what's the main reason why it takes so long still, right? Even if they are qualified, does it have to do with just the process of how utilities buy things? Do they have
Yeah.
to get approval for it? Like what does that look like?
Yeah, and I would consider 4 to 12 months for an enterprise customer for like a seven-figure contract to actually be pretty good, right? But it is still, it is long to most people. And there are a few hurdles that you have to jump through. Number one is utilities, especially the larger utilities, tend to buy by committee, right? So you have to do some very deep stakeholder management to make sure that you get, not just one VP on board, but you get a few VPs as well as someone sitting in the C-suite on board, right? That sign off on it. And so a lot of stakeholder management, a lot of selling to different stakeholders. And then once they've, you're at buy-in, right? Do they actually have the budget? So sometimes it's navigating budgets with different groups like IT and accounting, especially if you're selling software. And then the last piece, once all of that is sorted, is on contracting. And so if you've never negotiated an MSA with a utility before, well, just strap in because it's quite the process, and it can take several months for an MSA to be negotiated. So lots of legal happens in the process.
Mhm.
At the end of the day, these are, especially when you're selling software where you're ingesting utilities data, their data is critical infrastructure, right? So there are lots of guardrails around it that require careful negotiation around how you deal with that. And then there are other security measures at play as well. So it's a beast to get through, but once you're at the end of it, it's a simple order form change. And once you're in, right? At that point.
I see.
Yeah.
Got it. So once you're in with a pilot, you can expand the program pretty easily.
If there is, I was actually having this debate with someone recently, like you can decide to negotiate an MSA to do a pilot, right? But you're
Mhm.
putting a lot of legal work in to only get like, say, $100,000 pilot, something like that, right? Or you could get an innovation or a consulting services agreement in place to get the pilot done, right? Not have to go through all the legal, but then you have to negotiate the MSA if you want to upsell, if you want to go enterprise wide later down the road. So you can decide to punt the legal work that goes into it if you want, or compress the sales cycle for lack of a better term. So depending on the customer, you can decide to go different ways to, depending on how you feel about the customer, how the dynamics have been. But that's the challenge is there are a couple of things that you can sell. You can sell an enterprise wide contract if they're ready. You can start with a pilot and then expand. Many utilities still want to start with a pilot, even if you're validated, right, by other customers. So it really just depends. But there are a few
Yeah.
different ways you can go about it.
Yeah. Okay. And then you mentioned you guys speak the language of the engineers that you're reaching out to. How do you actually go about that outreach? Is it primarily through conferences? Do you just send them an email? Send them a carrier pigeon with a note on it? Like, what do you do?
I'm on the road a lot. Like when I first started, I just showed up at events and I just saw who I would meet, right? And maybe I knew a few people that I could connect with who could then connect me with the right person at a utility. But broadly speaking, it's starting off really cold. And in the utility sector, you can't start off cold and expect that email and LinkedIn is going to get you anywhere. You have to show up in person if you want to get anywhere, right? If you want to generate enough leads to have a conversion, to have your first contract, so on and so forth, right? In any time frame that investors at least would expect. So I go to a lot of events. My team goes to a lot of events. It's the number one way to really just be able to get in front of folks, empathize with them, understand also the content for conferences is important, right? Because understanding what they're thinking about and care about is important when you start a conversation with them. If you go to an engineer and automatically start talking about nuclear and they don't care about nuclear at all, and they're like a distribution engineer, right? Then you're not going to get anywhere with that person. So it's just becoming really familiar with what are the topics at hand, how do you talk about them, and then eventually finding your way in terms of what is their need and how can you actually service it.
Yeah, no, that's really tactical. I appreciate that. And I wanted to ask you about the team because I don't know like the nuances of all of your team, but you guys have, if I understand correctly, scaled up at a pretty rapid pace here with getting a product this difficult and this technical to market. So what are, I guess, some of your kind of core lessons as to building a team that have gotten you to the point you are right now?
Keep it highly functional, right? So we're a 13-person team and everyone is either building product or selling product, and there's no in between. I think part of that is when you're growing an early stage startup, you need to understand which resources that you can bring on like a fractional basis, right? So, we have a fractional CFO who just works for us part-time. And we're at a place where there are so many tools and systems that can help run an organization with minimal kind of labor involved, right? And so we, take advantage of those. Every full-time employee is a functional employee, and as a result, we run pretty lean, and you can get pretty far as a result. But one thing that we definitely don't do is like scope out, a job description that we might need in a few months and then try to fulfill a role when we think we're going to have a need in a few months, right? That is something we absolutely will probably going into, series A, B, C will not do, right? We very much believe in let's make sure that there's demand first before we bring someone on board to really accomplish a role. And so that's one thing that I've learned being a part of several startups is being very intentional with people that you're bringing in, understanding the nuanced capabilities, the gaps that they'll fill, and make sure that everyone stays busy and functional.
Yeah, I think it can be pretty. I mean, as the founder, sometimes like there's got to be like a tension between looking forward versus focusing on what's under your nose, right?
Yeah.
And depending on how your personality type, it can be very difficult. I am curious if you don't mind. So you said 17 people now or 13?
13.
13. So you got 13 people now. Like, what did it look like in terms of the phases of the team build out? So just go from you. I don't know if you have co-founders, but from you, the initial founding team, and then those team. Can you just walk people through that? Because a lot of founders early in their journey don't necessarily know how that's supposed to look or how it can look.
Yeah, and I'm happy to be pretty transparent on that. So I started the business on my own, and that is like I incorporated, I went out there, I talked to people, but obviously I'm not building product, right? So I was effectively selling things before we built anything, right? I ended up bringing my co-founder on board about 8 months later after I did a ton of market exploration, right? And I wanted to find the right person who is the right fit that could help me scale this company. So sure enough, through a mutual friend, I got connected to a man named Rahul, who was formerly the head of technology at Jupiter Intelligence, which is a global climate risk company, and they've done some work with utilities as well. And so he built their platform from scratch, right? And so in my mind, I said, okay, the perfect complement to me is someone who understands the climate and weather interactions very well, that understands how to build scalable systems and machine learning products very well. And I did not think I would find that person. So I thought I was going to have to compromise and, find maybe a mixture of people who bring that sort of background. But I ended up finding Rahul, brought him on board. And that was about, 8 months after I incorporated. And then everything has been fairly seamless ever since. We landed our first customer, I think 2 months after he came on board. That was Seattle City Light. We raised a pre-seed several months later. A month later, we signed our first multi-year contract with a utility in Texas. And then we've been growing the team ever since. So what ended up following is building a team of engineers around me while I went to go sell the product. Is I just needed people to actually deliver on the things that I was actually selling, right? In terms of the pilots that we were selling. And that was the stage that we were only selling pilots. And so we built a core team of engineers, platform engineer, as well as, we brought on a PhD from Stanford to lead our modeling efforts, built out those core functions. And then I finally was able to get to a place after we had, stable product and engineering to bring on a couple of additional salespeople to scale our sales efforts to start to deploy what we were building to the market. So that's effectively how it went down.
Okay, nice. So it's primarily like seems like the team is mostly engineers and then like 3-4 salespeople.
Yeah,
and yourself included.
Yeah, that's right. We have a couple of salespeople as well as our head of marketing, Dia. Yeah.
Okay, nice. Yeah, no, I appreciate you walking us through that because it's very fascinating to see how how differently you can build the team, because I've seen a lot of teams build very differently than that, or how they go about it. But I appreciate the let's get some contracts in place, and then we'll sort the rest out on the back end. I like that. So out of curiosity, with I guess when you look back at building a team, you guys are pretty early still in terms of team size, but are there any things that you would do differently, or at least core lessons that you would mention to other founders who are about to go through this journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think patience is definitely one thing, and to not be dissuaded when things may not work, in your favor. Having the mental and psychological stability as these things happen very rapidly and are highly consequential, especially at the earliest of stages, to really just stay patient and calm is one of the things that I can't, express enough. And then, the other major learning or quality I think that really helps is knowing what to prioritize when. And so there are, countless hours of things that you could be doing, but only the top 20% are going to get you 80% of the way. I very much believe in the 80-20 rule in that capacity. And so knowing how to prioritize, just like when we build our risk models, right? Prioritize, the top X percentage of activities, and then just let the rest slide away, and you will eventually hire people to take care of the rest, right? So knowing how to prioritize is huge.
Yeah. Do you have any methods of making sure that on a weekly basis you're not getting distracted by the shiny objects? Like how do you actually stay? Because it's impossible, I'm assuming, to always stay focused on those things. But how do you bring yourself back?
I honestly, I don't use any tools or any fancy tools, at least for this. I love using my notes doc, and I use Google Calendar, and then Calendly as my best friend as a personal schedule. I'm really light on tools, on advanced tools at least. But I think, developing an instinct in terms of what is important at a time and what's not is what I had to learn. Not just even doing this startup, but previously as well, when I had various time constraints. So I'll be honest, I don't know if there are any, easy ways to get to that point, but I think it just takes a little bit of time and effort being in the thick of it. But being conscious that you do need to prioritize, right? Like you can't do everything. You do need to make sure to take the calls that are really truly worthwhile for you at any given point in time.
Yeah, that's helpful. I'm curious. We're running out of time here. When you look at, I mean, we've gone through a very big transformation in kind of what is happening in the country with the climate tech space right now, and we're recording this during Climate Week, or Climate Week's about to happen, so this will be coming out a little later. But what do you how do you visualize where the climate tech or clean tech space is right now and where it's headed? Any kind of big changes that you think you're going to see, and anything specifically related to the energy sector or how you guys are pitching what you're doing? Are you removing the word climate? Are you just focusing on the energy, resilient stuff? Like, what do you see there on the macro?
It seems as though in the climate space, the aperture has widened quite significantly. So, a decade ago, it was mostly focused on clean energy, right? And that was a community that we were centering around. In this last phase of climate tech, the aperture was certainly broadened to things like agriculture and carbon removal and all sorts of non-energy technologies that can help solve the climate crisis, right? And then maybe for this next phase, what I'm seeing, and this is also reflecting on a lot of the climate tech events that I've seen in Climate Week, is I'm trying not to be self-serving here, but a definitely a broader look, a more deep look at adaptation and resilience. Resilience is just growing as a buzzword, especially with this new administration. And so there's a lot about Climate Week that is expanding on the adaptation and resilience side of things. And that broadens the aperture quite a bit, because what does resilience even mean, right? And how many different ways can you tackle resilience, right? There are the heat related illnesses where you're trying to prevent like foodborne illnesses and bacteria growth and all that sort of stuff. Trying to keep people cool, right? There's flood mitigation, there's wildfire mitigation. So there's all sorts of stuff on the resilience side that again broadens the aperture even further, which is why I think we see more and more events happening over time, right? And more diversity. Related to energy itself, it seems as though with the rising electricity costs and with the data center energy and AI nexus, there's a big conversation, of course, around the build out of the grid, but also how to do it affordably. And what are the new or existing tools that we have available to do it more affordably? And so I'm sure you've seen this as well. Energy efficiency and just straight up solar are becoming sexy again, right? And demand response, right? Becoming super sexy again as affordable ways to serve power to people, right? And so I'm excited to kind of learn a little bit more on if there's any truth to the those theories, if you're actually seeing increasing acceleration again in the energy efficiency space with maybe some of the newer technologies. But we'll see. That's what I'm excited to learn about when we go.
Yeah, it's interesting because at the same time as we've got we're hosting an event, is again, this will be coming out after that's already done, called how to win in the anti-climate era, which this administration is kind of relatively openly anti, like, let's control F, find climate things and get rid of them. But we've got this on one hand, and on the other hand, you're talking about the resiliency issues, and the core of that matter is really insurance companies are looking at all of the costs and the destruction that's coming, right? So therefore, there's so much like obvious cost coming that they're willing to invest the money up front to try to avoid that, right? So we've got this happening at the same time, and we've got the rising electricity costs in part, due to the AI, data center boom, but also I think with the current administration, we'll see some of the electricity prices might just rise because they're trying to cancel permits or whatnot. But the whole point is, it's very interesting to see that as this administration comes in, which is anti-climate to an extent, we've also got hypothetically a lot more investment going into the space because there's now such good economic case for all of these technologies. Even a very simple demand response program technology, like within a really small niche of energy, is actually a huge needle mover for most utilities, right? So I will be fascinated to see how things go, and I'm getting pretty excited for the conversations next week. But I appreciate you coming on, man. Any last calls to action or things that you're excited for in the coming months, other than the potential announcement you alluded to?
Calls to action. Look, I think especially for folks who are interested in climate now, and I know you spend a lot of time helping people find jobs in this space, and I've done the same, just more informally, right, through the clean energy community, especially when I was more actively involved. And I'll just say, there are so many exciting things that are happening just in climate broadly on both mitigation and adaptation. And so if you're looking at, opportunities in this space, I would definitely just keep your mind open, right? Because, everything matters. And so there are tons of companies that are still hiring for all sorts of different types of roles, and just keep your mind open, and I'm sure you're going to find something that fits. So that's maybe my last parting message for you.
That's a good thought. I think it is. I have noticed a lot of people are very discouraged and they think that there's not a lot of opportunities, but I still see plenty of hiring going on. There's some companies that are just being a little bit more discerning, but it seems like there's still quite a lot of jobs out there. Obviously, like the pure play renewables developers have taken a bit of a pause, but in general, there's still a lot of activity. So. Awesome, man. I've been looking forward to this interview for a while, so I'm glad we could get you on. I think we'll probably bump into each other during Climate Week. But anyways, we'll look forward to seeing how you guys continue to develop.
I can guarantee we'll bump into each other. So I'll see you there.
Take care, man. Cheers.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Awesome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. If you enjoyed the episode, leave us 5 stars on your favorite podcasting player. Share it with some of your friends who might find this particularly interesting, or go ahead and share it on social media to hopefully let the algorithms go wild with it. And speaking of algorithms, if you want to help us grow our reach, please go to YouTube and subscribe there. We are investing very heavily into this so that we can get new distribution through YouTube, because once you guys view it, you comment, you like it, and you're subscribing, they know to show it to more people. That's just how the name of the game works. And if you'd like to support the podcast and want help hiring, reach out to me directly for hiring support. Whether you need advice on how to craft your hiring strategy or you need traditional headhunting services, we've got you covered. This is the best way to support the podcast because it's what keeps the lights on. Yes, this is not free to produce, so thank you so much for reaching out. And thank you for tuning in every week. We will see you next time on Clean Techies.